and welcome back to Unspoken Emotions, the podcast where we gently bring voice to the feelings many people carry quietly while life continues moving around them, the emotions that shape who we become, even when the world only sees our strength. There is a particular kind of strength that people praise. It's the strength of the woman who holds everything together, the one who keeps showing up, who keeps driving, who keeps organising appointments, who keeps reassuring everyone else. But what we don't often talk about is the cost of being that person. What happens to the emotions that we don't have space? What happens when the caregiver becomes the patient? When grief overlaps with treatment? When the strong one has nowhere safe to fall apart? Today's conversation is about that kind of strength, not the polished version, not the inspirational quote version, the real one, the exhausted, late night, I don't know how I'm still standing version. My guest today is Susan Bloom, and for over 5 years she cared for her husband through illness while raising 3 sons. She drove tens of thousands of miles to specialists. She held her family steady. She held her community steady. And then, in the middle of it all, she was diagnosed with breast cancer herself. Her husband sadly passed away the day after her final chemotherapy treatment. And this is a conversation about grief layered on grief, about composure that hides collapse, and about resilience that is anything but glamorous. So, Susan, welcome to Unspoken Emotions, and thank you so much for joining us today. How are you today?
I'm fabulous. Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Well, Susan, before we go anywhere near timelines or roles, I just would like to begin here, if I may. When you look back at the woman who carried all of that, what do you feel towards her now?
A lot of compassion. And, if I would have known at the time, to be able to give myself a little bit more grace.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes we just struggle through. And I think having that compassion and grace, that time for ourselves, is definitely something. The wonderful thing of hindsight, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And like you said, I went from appointment to appointment. We drove, it was over 57,000 miles to see specialists, and that was just for him. Once I was diagnosed with breast cancer, there were even more miles.
Crazy to think that there was so much that you had to do at that time. But before the illness entered your life in, I suppose, such a consuming way, who were you, Susan? Who, like, not your roles, not the doctor's daughter, not the wife, not the mother. Who were you emotionally?
So I've grown a lot emotionally since his illness started. I was trained at the end in the last 2.5 years as an equine gestaltist, and that works. We have to do our own work in those emotions. And I would say that emotionally, before all of that, I shoved everything down. I was the strong person, not only for my family, but for everyone in the community, because he was really well known. I was really well known because I was the only doctor's daughter. He was an extrovert who liked to do things. So people, if he didn't know someone, he was probably related to him. and I was kind of an outsider in our little community, except for being the doctor's daughter, and it was a highly conservative community, and I was not raised in that way. So I was different, and I learned early on not to speak that stuff loudly.
Right. How does that make you feel now? Like, even saying that now, looking back to how you were and having how you had to be back then, or were expected to have been back then.
Well, and it's interesting. So in the Gestalt training, we learned about the Kiersey-Bates temperament sorter, which is very similar to the Myers-Briggs. And a lot of people know that one. But I actually had one of my parents' friends sent me that test when I was in college. So I took it when I was like 20. And when I looked at the results, when I took it, when I went into my Gestalt training, I had been a much higher introvert. And I think that that was because I felt like I couldn't say stuff, that I couldn't be myself. Um, I rode horses, and even in our rural community, I was the only person. There were a few people, but the only person in my class that showed them and that spent as much time with them as I did. Um, so that was, that was one of those things. I actually did a story at the Moth a few months ago that I called Boots and Masks, and it was about when I had my boots on, my mask came off, and when I was any other time, I had the mask on, the mask that I thought I needed to wear when I was in that community.
Do you ever find that exhausting?
Yes.
Back? Do you ever not feel like, oh my God, it's crazy, these masks?
I had never thought about that.
No.
Of course, when he was sick, there was so much exhaustion, physical, mental, because I thought I had to stay strong for everyone else. And there's a fine line between staying strong for everyone and feeling your own emotions when you're trying to stay strong and you don't want anyone else to see those emotions. Yes, you push them down and try not to feel them.
Yeah. It's only a recipe for disaster, though, isn't it? It's like a bubbling pot that eventually
implodes.
For sure. I mean, sometimes women are chosen for strength long before they ever volunteer for it. And do you think that was true for you?
Probably. It's really kind of funny. My dad, in 2001, being the only, well, I guess he wasn't the only doctor in town at the time, but he slipped on the ice and had a subdural hematoma, which he wouldn't let Mom take him to the emergency room. He said, "I'm okay." And he practiced medicine for 2.5 days. When they finally flew him to Denver in a snowstorm, and they evacuated the hematoma, and then the next morning he got up and had a brain bleed, a hemorrhagic stroke, and he was in ICU for almost a month. He was in inpatient rehab in Denver for 6 months, and I think it was a year or more after he did outpatient rehab there in Denver, which that's one of those places where we lived. It was 250 miles, but it was the major place you could go for something like that. And so he was there. They were there for well over a year and a half, almost 2 years. And my mom would look at me during my husband's illness and she'd say, "I don't know how you do it." I said, "Mom, you did the same thing. You were there with him every day and you did the exact same." "Oh, no." "Yes, you did the same thing."
I mean, when your husband became ill, life must have just narrowed into, I suppose, survival mode, like appointments, miles on the car, going here or there, children to steady, a community watching. What did it feel like internally during those years? Because I guess from the outside, I imagine people saw composure, but what was happening underneath?
I'm sure there was a storm of stuff going on underneath. I pushed it down and ignored it as much as I could, even for myself. And it always seemed like when I had time to take a breath, then it would come up again. Something would come up. Oh, okay, I have to make this appointment, or a doctor called, or whatever that case was. Well, we need to change his meds, or we need to go get a CT scan or an X-ray, whichever one the specialist ordered. Fortunately, we could go have those done about 20 miles away rather than the 350 where the specialist was.
Wow. Wow. And in terms of the diagnosis, when you had that, do you want to share what that diagnosis was?
Well, it was a really rare autoimmune disease that started it, called relapsing polychondritis. It was complicated by a stricture in his esophagus where it got to the point that he could not eat. So he had a feeding tube, and then at the end he had what they call TPN, which is IV nutrition. And it was probably the PICC line. It probably got infected because he had a line placed so that we could do that. And that's probably because his death was caused by septic shock. And that's probably what it was the PICC line got infected.
Right.
And his body was in a place where it couldn't fight that off.
But he went through this for a number of years, and you were his caregiver for, was it 5 years?
It was 5.5. And in all honesty, yes, I consider myself as caregiver. He wasn't an invalid. He did a lot of stuff himself. He would go out and work, although he had sold. So he'd been a farmer rancher, and he had sold the land, his farmland, not the pasture, but his farmland. He'd sold, I think, 2 years. 2 years before, 2.5 years before he died. And then that fall, he also sold the cattle that he had. So we had all this pasture land and nothing to do with it because the cows were gone. And at the time he got sick, our 2 oldest sons were out of the house. The middle one was at university, fortunately, and he had apartments where it was like 45 minutes from the hospital where we had a lot of appointments, and so we could stay with him when we were on this side of the state, which was nice to have that instead of be in a hotel room.
And at what point into that journey did you find out that it was going to be terminal? Like he wasn't going to pull through from this?
It was never clear. It was when he was diagnosed. I have a good friend who has had rheumatoid arthritis for probably close to 35, 36 years. And I thought, it's an autoimmune disease. And I thought, well, this is manageable. And I believe had he not had all those other complications, one of the other complications he had was he started getting anemic. And they determined that he had a blood cancer called MDS, and he had probably 30 transfusions. And about a month before he died, he needed another one. And by that point, his body was seeing that donor blood as foreign and was fighting it. So they couldn't just give him any blood. And that was the first time they flew him to KU Med Center because he had gotten so anemic that they couldn't do anything at our local rural hospital. And they were concerned for that.
Mm-hmm. In situations like that, there must have been an immense amount of pressure on you, expectedly or otherwise, to obviously be the strong one and to hold it all together, to do everything, to carry on. Were were there nights like where that kind of pressure just felt unbearable? And did you ever resent having to be the strong, that strong one? Or did you not even allow yourself to have that thought?
Not very often, but I know he had spent almost 3 weeks at KU Med Center inpatient. Um, he was supposed to be going in for surgery, and then he got sick, and they wouldn't do the surgery. And they couldn't figure out what was wrong with him, and so they took a bunch of tests and said, okay, so we'll dismiss you in the morning. And in the morning, his temperature would spike just enough so that they wouldn't let him out. And they took at the beginning of that, they gave him some strong antibiotics, which reduced his kidney function. So when they did those tests, they had to stop those strong antibiotics. And one of the tests that they took and sent to the Mayo Clinic came back as possibly brucellosis, which is an old cattle disease. And when I told my dad that, he said, gosh, in the 50 years since I was in medical school, I didn't ever see a case of brucellosis. Well, that's interesting. But they didn't have the results for sure at that point. They said, well, they need to do another test at Mayo. And they finally did send him home and said, if we need to, we'll do this stronger antibiotic at home. And that was just a nightmare. It was a week's worth of this strong antibiotic. And I thought the antibiotic was going to kill him. He'd go in, his veins were not good. And they'd say, well, the infusion will take about an hour. Always ended up taking 2 or 2.5 hours because they had to redo the IV. And I'm pretty sure it was during that time that I had gone to the store, and I came home and I sat out in front of the house in my Jeep, and I thought, I just want this to be over. I want him to be well again. And in that moment, it occurred to me that there was another outcome, that it could be over. And as I thought it, I immediately pushed it aside. The other outcome, of course, would be that he would die and then it would be over. And as I struggled with that realization, it occurred to me that people in that position probably do think that. And one of the last pieces of work that I did at a Gestalt training was about that, about knowing that there would be a sense of relief and that everything would be over. And that's kind of a hard realization to understand, that eventually your relief may come from the death of a loved one. I've since heard people say similar things about their aging parents, and it's a hard realization.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you, Susan. It's not easy when you verbalize these things, because quite often some people may have these thoughts, and that's one thing, and then verbalizing them, that's another. And it's hard for people to actually admit to having these thoughts in the first place, but you do, and it's just real life. It's just real life. So thank you so much for sharing that. I suppose as well, and I'm curious to this because in small towns, people will know you, they watch, they talk. Did you ever feel a pressure to perform, I guess, the strength, for the community too?
For sure. And it was something I had grown up with because my parents moved there when Mom was pregnant with me, so I was born there. And Dad originally started with another physician who was the only, he may have been the only doctor in town at that time. And then when I was 8, he suddenly died of a heart attack, which left dad is the only physician. So everyone knew who I was. And yes, I always felt like I had to. And even though he didn't push me to do this, I remember my mom saying that she used to try to be the proper doctor's wife. And then she decided sometime that she could be the hippie version of herself, because she would have she liked folk music and stuff like that. And she quit wearing her hair in the proper way, and just said, this is it.
Yeah.
I'm me, and that's who I am. And so they didn't ever push me to be anyone. And I still felt a lot of that, yes. And then when Mike got sick, it was, I have to be strong for the entire community. When my dad hit his head and they flew him to Denver, I had gone back to college, and I was driving 90 miles one way to go to classes. And I stopped going to the local grocery store because it could take 3 hours, because people would stop me and ask me about my dad.
Oh.
And so I would get groceries when I was in the university town, 90 miles away. And I still had, some people still knew me.
That's crazy, isn't it?
It was.
Oh, bless.
And I had, at that point, I had 2 boys in school and a 4-month-old baby. Yeah, like a 4-month-old baby. I didn't have time.
It's lovely,
3 hours at the grocery store.
Exactly. I was going to say, it's lovely that people care and they're asking, but you just haven't got time for this. Oh, bless. And 90 miles, go 90 miles just to get to class. Wow.
Yeah.
That's sheer dedication and commitment right there. So how you were doing that, I do not know. And then, as if that's not enough. Oh, sorry, go on.
That was, of course, before Zoom and all the stuff we do now, all the virtual stuff.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
So
yeah. So much easier now, isn't it?
Yeah, you go to class.
Yeah. Yeah. So as if all of that wasn't enough pressure and enough responsibility for you, then 8 months before your husband passed, you had your own diagnosis to deal with. And I can't imagine the emotional complexity of that. So when you heard the words breast cancer, what happened inside you?
Well, and it's kind of funny, because we spent would have been 3 years before that, in the fall, we drove to KU Med Center 6 times in 8 weeks. And that's a 350-mile drive, because they thought that Mike had lung cancer. And so we made all these trips, and they did all these tests, and they'd say, okay, come back in a week and we'll give you the results. And finally, and then the results would not turn up anything. And they'd say, okay, well, we need to do this test. And they'd set that up, and we'd go back and get the results, and it would be nothing. And finally we saw the lung surgeon, and they did a PET scan, and he said, well, both of the options that I had been thinking about for your case are overkill for what I see on the PET scan. So we're not going to do anything. And that was right before, it was Thanksgiving fell in there, but it was right before Christmas. And that was the first time that I went into the holidays just being grateful that my entire family was there. And so when I went and got the nearly yearly mammogram at a different place than I'd had it before, and they called and said, we need your results from the last 2 mammograms you've had. And I'd had wonky mammograms before, and they'd say, well, we need to do an ultrasound or whatever. So it didn't faze me when they said that. And then when I had the biopsy, the doctor said, 85% of these are benign. And I'm like, okay, it'll be fine. Yeah. And then the a few days later when she called me, and basically she said, well, the results aren't what we wanted. It's like, okay. And do you want me to tell you over the phone? You just did, so you may as well.
Oh my gosh. I mean, what's happened to people? What's that, a doctor? I mean, we see here all the time as well, their bedside manner is gone. It's taken a hike so long ago. What's happened to these people? They're just not tactile at all, are they? Wow. Wow.
And so I think I allowed myself about 10 minutes to have a pity party and why did this happen to me and whatnot. And then I sat down and I thought, well, so what is this going to teach me? What is the universe trying to teach me? I'll learn my lesson and I'll send it back to the universe. I don't know if it was that weekend or the next weekend that I went to see my massage therapist, and I told her that, and she said, yes, we are going to wrap it up, put a bow on it, and send it back to the universe. Just send it back to where it came from. And I believe that mindset, I had no trouble with chemo. I mean, I would have chemo and we would get in the car sometimes and go on, because chemo was 90 miles towards KU Med Center. So we'd go on for Mike's appointments, or sometimes I had them too. But we're already 90 miles that way. We may as well. And I would schedule it that way. Or our youngest son, who was still in high school, had golf tournaments. And I scheduled it so that on Wednesdays, because golf tournaments were sometimes on Tuesdays and sometimes they were on Thursdays. And I didn't miss one, except for when Mike was in the hospital in Kansas City. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And radiation was easy for me too. I didn't ever get sick. And I think that a big part of that was my mindset, and that, yes, this happened. I'm going to take my lesson and I'm going to give it back to you.
That's an incredible way of looking at it and dealing with it, because I know there's so many people become, quite ill from the treatment. They feel so much worse for having the treatment, and just going through the treatment. But to be able to literally have the treatment on the Wednesday in between, and still, in between your son's golf tournaments and things like that, and still attend these things and still, carry on driving. People are in bed for, they lose a couple of days, sometimes longer than that. I've heard, stories. So yeah, I mean, do you really think that you were able to stay so healthy then throughout this treatment because of your mindset?
I do. And it could be that I also had no other option. I mean, I was caregiving for my husband, and I was the one taking care of making appointments and doing all of that. And I had no other option.
I guess you didn't have time to be ill yourself because you had so. It's just, I haven't got, come on, universe, I haven't got time for this. It's like, why would you do this to me right now? So, wow. Okay. So when you heard those words though, when you were given the diagnosis, did you feel any fear at the time, or anger or numbness, or did you just immediately kind of shift into problem solving mode?
I allowed myself, I do think it was about 10 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, to kind of have a pity party, and went out and told my husband that the biopsy results weren't what we wanted. And yeah, there's of course a lot of fear there. The kind of interesting thing is, so it was stage 1 breast cancer. And when I went to see the surgeon the first time, she said, well, you have the option of either having a lumpectomy or a mastectomy. And I always thought that, given a diagnosis of breast cancer, that I would have them cut off because I was done with them. They cause problems when you ride. It's a balance issue, or it can be. And it wasn't what I chose. I chose the lumpectomy, which kind of surprised me. Well, except that I'm one of those who like the least invasive option is the better one. So
yeah.
yeah.
And everyone's different. There'll be some who will just say straight off the bat, no, just remove them. I don't want any chance. And then there'll be others, and for all different reasons. So there's no right or wrong.
No, there's
right.
not.
I mean, everybody is just what you feel is right for you. So, okay. And then, obviously your husband sadly passed away. And he passed the day after your final chemo treatment. I mean, that in itself must have been such a layered moment, grief, I suppose, relief that the chemo was done, exhaustion, shock. What did that day actually feel like? How were you that day? I mean, must have been so mixed.
Well, and it was. So he'd had trouble with his PICC line on Monday. Normally he would go in and have it cleaned. He had to have it cleaned once a week. And he had gone in and done that, and then that night it plugged. So we went back to the ER and they kind of took a look at it. And we went back home, and the next day he was in just immense pain. So we called the doctor's office and said, well, should we come into the clinic or go to the ER? And they said, well, you need to go to the ER. However, there's been a really bad car accident. So I don't know how long it's going to be before they can get you in. Oh, okay, so we didn't rush. And he wanted to go see his chiropractor. And as we left the chiropractor's office, he looked at me and he said, you need to go to the ER. And I said, I know, that's where we're headed. And when we were out in the waiting room at the ER, and by the time we got there, I think they had one patient left. So we didn't have to wait long, but his primary care doctor came through the waiting room and he kind of chuckled and said, well, maybe we should just send him to KU. And I said, yeah, maybe so. In retrospect, that's probably what should have been done. And so this was Tuesday, and we were there for hours, and they were getting ready to send him home with me. And his oxygen level was really low. And I looked at the ER practitioner, and I said, that's about 10 points lower than it normally is. That's not normal. And then his temperature spiked, and they said, okay, we're going to keep him. So he was in the hospital Tuesday night. And Wednesday, when I had chemo, my dad drove me to Hayes. And when we got back, I went over to see him. He was grumpy, more so than usual. And the nurse came in and they hadn't been able to give him his IV nutrition because one of his PICC lines was still plugged. And the other one they needed to use for the IV stuff. And she came in and she couldn't get it unplugged. And in those small rural hospitals, at the bigger hospitals, they have people on staff who can do that. But at these small ones, yeah, they might have someone on staff, but not there all the time. And so I went home and had dinner and a glass of bubbly wine. I had quit drinking pretty much during chemo with my parents and went on with my evening. And then I was getting ready to go see my primary care doctor the next morning, and the hospital called and said, we're flying in to Kansas City. You have about 40 minutes to pack a bag and get here. And I said, oh, okay. And then once I did get there, I watched for an hour before the flight crew got there while they tried to stabilize him. Another hour after the flight crew got there, he'd been intubated. And finally, we were on our way to the ambulance to the airport, and we hadn't even reached cruising altitude when his heart monitor went flat. And that's that's just like on TV. It's flat and there's beeping, and I wanted to help. Obviously, there was nothing I could do. I mean, he had, I think, a paramedic and a nurse that were working on him. So I just kind of tried to make myself small. I realized that there had been so many times that I had done that during his illness, had pushed myself aside for whatever it was he needed. And they got his heartbeat back, and then it went flat again. And again, they got it back. And I heard the pilot say, we're diverting, we're going to go to Hayes instead of Kansas City, which is 90 miles instead of 350. And the chaplain met me at the door. Of course, the trauma team met him, but the chaplain met me at the door and took me to a private waiting room. And it was before I could even, I called my dad, and before I was even finished, the doctor came in. And I knew that he hadn't made it at that point. He wouldn't have even had to say anything. So yeah, it was, kind of that surreal feeling. The boys came and got me and brought his sister as well, who the one of them went to she worked at the bank in Oakley, and went to tell her, and she was going to stay there and work. And some of her coworkers said, no, you need to go. You need to go home. And it was at that point when my middle son said, yeah, you can go with us to Hayes, which gave her something to do.
Oh my gosh. Bless you. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's such a sensitive, personal moment for you there, what you went through. Can't even imagine it myself. Obviously, having been the strong one then for so long, and just keeping pushing and plugging away, doing what you needed to do for all that time, being there for everyone else. When that finally happened, did you allow yourself then to just crumble, or were you not? I can see you shaking your head. Were you not allowing yourself to go there? I mean, are you a machine? What are you?
No.
Or did grief just kind of quietly arrive later? I mean, how was it for you?
I think part of it was that I had gone through some pre-grieving with him as well. I mean, I think somewhere in the back of my head, I always knew that that I would outlive him. We'll put it that way. And that all of the Gestalt work that I had done in my training had put me in the best place I could have been emotionally to deal with his illness. I'd been doing that training I was supposed to have graduated just after I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and the trainer said, why don't you take some time and do your treatment. And as a matter of fact, when I graduated from that program, Mike and my parents had driven out for graduation. And as she handed me my certificate, she said, this will be here when you're ready. Do not rush. And I thought, so this was a Saturday, and I had a chemo treatment on Wednesday.
Of course you did. Of course you did.
And I thought she's saying, just don't rush. You still have treatment to finish. Get well, then you can do this. She read my husband's energy and said later, she told me it was waning, and I knew he wasn't going to be on the planet much longer. So, yeah. And she would have never told me that until I outright asked her later. But so I think at some level I knew and had done a lot of work around that. And that work put me in the best place I could have been, again, to be diagnosed with breast cancer and to lose my husband.
Yeah. Do you think you processed grief at that time, or did you postpone processing it?
I might have postponed it a little bit, yes. I know they had given me, I think it's Ativan for nausea. And the first 2 nights after he died, it got to be 2 a.m, and I was still kind of wide awake. And it's like, no, I have got to sleep. So the pharmacist had told me at one point that what that did was it turned your brain off so that, you don't, so that your brain doesn't feel like you're sick, I guess. I don't know why they use it for nausea. And I thought, well, so I can sleep. And again, I went right back into doing things. Our youngest son he was on swim team in the summer, and this was late into his swim meets. So I took him. I didn't think I was going to be able to, but I took him to the swim meet that weekend and had the next week he had his final swim meet. And the day after that, or the Monday after that, I had my first appointment with radiology in Kansas City. So it was still kind of yeah.
My gosh, nonstop.
It was.
Nonstop. Mm.
And
Nonstop.
actually, it was because I had a lot of people ask me if I wanted them to go with me to Kansas City for that appointment. And I said no. This is something I need to do alone. And it was strange to go to KU Med Center without him. And it didn't really hit me until I was almost home the next day, when I had to stop out at the cemetery and cry, but it had been delayed a little bit. Yeah,
it's got to come out sometime, isn't it? So, obviously it was catching up with you then.
And the way I see it, it comes still. Something will trigger it, a song or a picture, or when I was trying to catch up on the bookwork, a receipt from one of our trips to KU or wherever we'd been. And I sit with it for however long it lasts. Usually it's not long, and then I'm able to move on. One evening, I went out to feed my horses, and a song came on the radio that made me think of him. I mean, I have a whole playlist of songs if I just want to sit in grief that I could put on. But the song Perfect by the young redheaded guy came on.
Ed Sheeran.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I sat there and listened to it. And as I sat there, I watched one of my mares start what we call leeching. So she was releasing energy for me, and that negative energy, and trying to bring me up. And she's one who would always do that. If I went out there with her, she would try to give me her attention and heal me.
I think animals do pick up on our emotions a lot more than we give them credit for. But in terms of humans and in terms of grief, a lot of people might try to shy away from grief and shy away from going through those emotions and trying to sort of compartmentalize them. And sometimes that's not always the best option. It might be for a little while because you have to get through, a particular period of your life. But when you do sit with your emotions like you did, and when you did sit with your grief, when you felt that there were times where I just, I felt upset, I felt emotional, and I just needed to sit there with it. Do you think that the embracing that time just really helped you?
Definitely, yes.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is what would you recommend to other people that may be going through some grief of their own and may not always be in the headspace to deal with that grief or the deal with the emotions?
We have a piece of work that we do with people that through the Gestalt, specifically for grief. And it helps immensely with, gosh, I hate to say processing it, but living with it and moving with it, and the horses help. So in 2020, my dad was diagnosed with colon cancer. And I was talking to one of my colleagues and I said, I've never done a grief piece around Mike. Maybe it's time to do that before I have another one to do around my dad. And I didn't know if this would work. She was in Colorado and she said, well, let's do it. And so we set up a Zoom where I went out to be with my horses and she was out with her horses. And we actually did one via Zoom and it was beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. And that, like I said, I hate to say it helps you process it, but it helps to move with it a little easier. And that's what people need.
Yeah.
I never allowed myself, or maybe it just was not me, to be one who fell so deeply into grief that I couldn't do anything else. And I know there are people that do that. I have a friend who is told that she just needs to get over it. It's been long enough. And she's like, no, I don't. And it's my belief that grief will be there forever. You lose a loved one, you will grieve forever. And it's different for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's still kind of, I don't get shocked easily. But at times when I hear the expression of, in this day and age, you should be over it by now, whether that's 5 weeks, 5 months, 5 years, 50 years, however long it takes somebody to get over it, it takes them. And sometimes some people will never get over it. I don't know whether you truly do get over losing someone. I think you just learn to live with it. But for somebody to come along and tell you how you should be and how you should feel, and that you should be over it by now, I mean, that kind of fills me a little bit. I can feel the hairs on the back of my neck go up when people, when I hear someone said that, because I'm like, what right do you have? You just don't say it, just don't say anything at all. Yeah, it does frustrate me. But you now, in terms of your life now and rebuilding your life and your purpose now, Susan, you now partner with horses to create healing experiences for others. And I guess that feels symbolic somehow, like a gentle strength, a presence, regulation. How did that path find you? Was it intentional, or did healing lead you there?
No, it was not at all intentional. The program that I took, I don't know how long before I actually started it, but I had talked with my husband about it. One evening, I think when we were going to marriage counseling, maybe, and his comment was, there is no way in hell we're going to spend more money on your horses. They should be making money, not. And so I let it drop. And then he got sick in 2013. I actually applied for a job the first time that he was in the hospital. They were admitting him to the hospital. I had my laptop there and wrote my cover letter and sent my resume and application in from the hospital. And to this day, I don't know what the cover letter said. And it doesn't matter. And I got the job, and 2 years later, it was a tourism job, and I was the first time tourism director they'd ever hired. And 2 years later, there's a small museum there, and the woman who was the director there was resigning. And so they were going to combine my job with that job. At that point, I'd already taken off all of my paid time off. And I'd had 2 coworkers who'd given me over 2 weeks of their sick leave that they hadn't used. And I'd taken time off without pay. And I said, how can I take on another full-time job? I said, I'm not going to do it. And I went to my dad and I said, this is what I'd like to do. I'd like to do this Equine Gestalt program. And said, Mike won't pay for it. We don't have the money to pay for it right now. And he said, okay, do it. So that was in January of 2016. And then and when we did live in-person trainings, we were coached by either Melissa, the woman who founded the program, or another student in the program. And that's where I got to do all my emotional healing and work. It's a 2-year program. And I was diagnosed with breast cancer in November. I had just taken my final exam, but I still had some paperwork to do and one more in-person training that I'd had to delay because of surgeries. And Melissa said, you just take your time. And so it was about 5 months later when I finished. And that was about 5 weeks before Mike died. So I had that, the Equine Gestalt certification. And in 2020, I was ready to really get going with the business. I had taken my time, like Melissa had said. Well, and then in 2020, everything got shut down.
Yes. Good old COVID.
Yeah. And I knew that Western Kansas probably wasn't the best place to try to do that kind of a business, because the population at that point that I wanted to serve, well, and still, I would like to help doctors avoid burnout. And it's a day to get there from anywhere. You can't jump on a plane in Kansas City and come to Oakley. You can't even jump on a plane in Kansas City and go to Hayes. You would either have to go through Denver or Dallas-Fort Worth, because, and then it's another 85 to 90 miles to where we lived.
Gosh, yeah.
And so it took me about 5 years after his death, I got the courage up to sell the pasture land that we had left. I bought a 100-acre ranch here about an hour from Kansas City, and have started my practice in a more populated area.
Amazing. Well done you. Well done you. When you look back now at everything that you have carried over the years, from the miles, the chemo, the grief, the pressure, what did that season teach you about resilience that you, I suppose, didn't know you possessed?
Gosh, that's a tough one. Because it always felt like I just went from one thing to the next. Not that I was being resilient, that I was moving forward. And maybe it's that, and I hear this a lot in business, that it's the baby steps that can keep you moving forward, keep you resilient. They add up to so much.
Yeah, definitely. It's a compound effect, isn't it, as well? So if someone is listening right now who might be in the middle of caregiving, holding it all together, who might be feeling exhausted or scared, or I suppose just not wanting to burden anyone with their own emotions, what would you want to gently tell them? And what do caregivers need permission to feel?
They need permission to feel, because there is that fine line.
Full stop.
Yeah, there is that fine line. And they need to take care of themselves. One of the things that I think was the best way I could have taken care of myself, I said my son lived about 45 minutes from the hospital. And I would go back there. I'd spend all day at the hospital. I would go back there every night. And that's not entirely true. There were a few nights that I spent at the hospital because we got there late and I'm like, I'm too tired to even drive. Or one night it was snowing and I said, I am done driving in the snow. But
most of the time.
Yeah, most of the time I went back, and if he was not working, we would go out for dinner. If he was, I'd sit down and watch a stupid romantic comedy just to get some, and usually have a glass of wine, but to get some normalcy, to get my mind off of everything that was good, to zone out, basically.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably the best thing I could have done for myself. I remember the long hospital stay, which was in the oncology ward. I went out one day with a woman who said, "Oh, I haven't set foot out of this hospital in 2 weeks. The 2 weeks that my daughter's been there, her adult daughter, not her juvenile daughter, but her adult daughter."
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, it made me feel kind of guilty because I was leaving every night. And I've since thought, no, that's not the way it should be. You need to take some time for yourself. You need to decompress and to let down and feel whatever you need to feel. And I had in one of his hospital stays, the surgeon saw me in the lobby and he asked how I was doing. And I responded with how my husband was doing. And he said, "Yeah, I hear he's been kind of ornery." He said, "What about you?" I said, "Well, I'm okay." And he said, "When you get home, I want you to call your girlfriends and go out." I said, "Well, I don't really have any friends that are that close that I can go out with." And he said, "Well, then get on the phone." And again, it's that, kind of keeping things normal and blowing off steam that we're holding down. If you need to, you could cry with them or whatever you need to do. So take care.
Incredible. Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think when you're constantly having to be the strong one for everyone else, and especially sometimes we wear that mask and we have that strong mask on in front of them. If you don't ever have any respite from there, you don't have any time to process your own emotions and and feel the emotions that you're truly feeling and sit with them, release them, let off steam, because you're too busy trying to be the strong one for everyone else. So yeah, I think definitely having some you time, some downtime to do whatever that is, and however that looks is really, really important. So thank you so much for your words of wisdom and for sharing your story today. You really, I just thank you for your honesty and your openness. And I think what I admire most about your story is that you don't glamorize strength. You lived it, you carried it, you survived it, but you also show that strength doesn't mean never breaking. It just means continuing even when you are breaking. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing your story with us. And I hope our listeners can take something from there and adapt some of your words of wisdom to any situation that they might be going through right now. So thank you.
I hope so too.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. And to everyone listening, if you are the strong one in your family, in your workplace, in your friendship circle, please hear this. You are allowed to be human. You are allowed to feel exhausted. You are allowed to ask for support. You are allowed to fall apart sometimes. Strength is not silence. And Susan, thank you again for reminding us that healing can grow even from the heaviest seasons. So if this conversation resonated with you, please share it with someone who may need it and follow Unspoken Emotions so that we can continue having the conversations people don't feel safe enough to start. Remember, as always, there is strength in every step and courage in every story. And until next time, big love.